Cesar Bosco never raised his voice. He didn't have to. Every word from him landed like a stone dropped into still water, subtle but heavy. Wyatt Larson had learned to read those ripples over time. At first, it had been charming, that calm detachment. Like he was in control of every emotion, every reaction. But 3 years into a relationship built on unspoken things, Wyatt knew better. That silence wasn't peace, it was judgment. She remembered the exact moment it all started to unravel. The night she had come home in scrubs, drenched in someone else's blood, hair stuck to her face from 12 hours in an understaffed ER. Her back ached, her feet throbbed. She had almost cried in her car before walking in the door. But she'd saved a life that night, cut a trash tube into a man's throat with shaking hands while the doctor froze. That should have meant something. Instead, Cesar looked up from his laptop and said, "You're a great nurse, Wyatt." Just like that. No hug, no pride, no fire in his eyes, just that, flat praise. Then he added, "But you're not built for this kind of life." "What kind of life?" she'd asked, still standing in the hallway with her bag half slipping off her shoulder. He didn't look at her when he said it. Wife, family, real stability. Wyatt had stood there still as death, waiting for a punchline that never came. When it finally registered, she didn't cry. She didn't scream. She just turned around, walked into the bathroom, and threw up. That night, she slept on the couch not because Cesar asked her to, but because his silence had pushed her out of their bed. A silence that said she was admirable, but not desirable. Useful, but not enough. The thing about Wyatt was she didn't fall apart. She rebuilt, quietly, carefully. She started saving, not just money, but her pride. She took extra shifts, accepted overtime, even offered to train the new nurses no one else had patience for. That's how she met Delphina Buckridge, a walking contradiction in red heels and a blunt-cut bob who used to be a patient but came back to drop off thank you pastries one day. Turned out she ran a high-end image consulting firm downtown. Said Wyatt had the eyes of a woman people would pay to listen to if she'd just learned to speak differently. "Come by," Delphina had said with a wink. "You've got the bones of something expensive." Wyatt had laughed then. It sounded insane, but 3 days later, on a whim, she went. Maybe it was the way Cesar hadn't looked at her in weeks. Maybe it was the hollow feeling in her chest. Whatever it was, she walked into Delphina's office and didn't walk back out the same. Delphina taught her things no one ever had. How to stand still and own a room. How to make silence seductive instead of sad. How to wear perfume so it whispered instead of screamed. Wyatt learned how to read people, two rich ones, powerful ones. Men with money but hollow lives who craved a woman who could make them feel something again. It started slow. Just conversations, dinners, attention, nothing physical. Not at first. Wyatt wasn't selling her body. She was selling presence, comfort, intelligence. She became an emotional luxury, and that was more expensive than sex ever could be. Brannon Johns was the first one who truly paid attention. Not just with his money, though he had enough of it to burn down a city and build it again, but with his eyes. He looked at Wyatt like she was art, not for what she could do but for what she already was. He asked questions. He listened. When she told him about the trash tube, he looked horrified and amazed. "You saved someone's life," he said, like that meant something. Like it was more than just a job. And when she laughed, really laughed for the first time in months, Brannon touched her hand and said, "You know, I think you'd make a brilliant wife. Not a nurse, not just a woman, a wife, a whole person." That night, Wyatt went home and looked at Cesar, still in his glass bubble of quiet disdain, and she saw it clear as day. He hadn't rejected her because she wasn't enough. He rejected her because she made him feel like he wasn't. She stood in the kitchen, dressed in tailored silk now, hair smooth, skin glowing in candlelight from a dinner Brannon had sent over. Cesar looked up, finally, and his brows drew together. "You've changed." "No," Wyatt said softly, sipping her wine. "I've just become someone you can't afford." She didn't need to slam the door when she left. She had already closed it months ago. Cesar didn't chase her. He just stood there, arms crossed, staring at the space where she had stood, like it might rearrange itself into a different ending. He always thought she would bend back into shape, fall into line the way good women did. But Wyatt wasn't built like that, not anymore. She didn't move in with Brannon right away. That would have felt like replacing one cage with another, even if this one was lined with cashmere and compliments. Instead, She got herself a place downtown, small, sleek, private, a penthouse that overlooked the city, with glass walls that made her feel like she finally had nothing to hide. The money came easily. Delphina helped her set up a portfolio of clients, lonely, tired men with inherited power who wanted the illusion of connection more than the mess of real love. Wyatt became what they dreamed of: a listening ear, a sharp mind, a disarming smile. She didn't pretend to love them. That would have been a lie. But she made them feel seen, and in this world that was rare enough to be priceless, she had dinner in Dubai, lunch in London, and came home only when she missed the sound of her own name not being whispered like a secret. She wasn't just expensive, she was exclusive. Caesar saw her again 6 months later, by accident, a gala for a children's health fund she'd helped organize. He was standing at the bar in a crumpled blazer, 2 drinks and enough to dull his edge. Not enough to forget her. Wyatt walked in on Brannon's arm, a navy silk gown hugging her like it had been sewn onto her skin. Diamonds kissed her collarbone, her hair swept up like it was sculpted. She didn't look at Caesar, not at first. She gave the photographers a soft smile, thanked the donors, brushed elbows with diplomats. Then she turned. Their eyes met across the room. His drink paused mid-air. She could see it, the flicker of regret, the quiet recognition of a woman he had once dismissed as ordinary. His lips parted slightly, like he might call her name. She didn't walk over. She didn't need to. Instead, Brannon leaned in and murmured something, and she laughed, soft, real, unbothered. The kind of laugh she used to save for Caesar, back when she thought he deserved it. He watched her the rest of the night. She felt it. That ache of realizing too late what something had been worth. Afterward, as Brannon helped her into the car, Wyatt paused. That was him, wasn't it? He asked. Brannon wasn't stupid. She nodded. The man who said I was a great nurse. Brannon chuckled under his breath. What an idiot. Wyatt smiled, not bitter, just knowing. He didn't want a wife. He wanted someone smaller than him, and you outgrew him, Brannon said simply. The car pulled away from the curb, but Caesar didn't leave. He just stood there under the streetlights, holding a glass he'd forgotten to sip, watching the woman he'd lost for the second time. The thing about Wyatt now was she wasn't angry. Not anymore. What Caesar had said that night, about her not being built for a wife's life, used to sting. Now, it just sounded like a man confusing his own limits with hers. She hadn't set out to be expensive. But the truth was, the moment she realized her worth, no one could afford to keep her for free. In her apartment that night, Wyatt took off the diamonds, undid her hair, and sat on the edge of the bed. Alone, but not lonely. Her phone lit up. A message from Delphina. New client. Very high profile. Said he's tired of women who want his money, not his story. Interested? Wyatt smiled to herself and typed back. Let's meet him. If his story's worth hearing, I'll name a price. She lay back on the soft sheets, staring at the city lights through the window, and thought of the girl she'd been. The girl who'd cried in the car before walking into Caesar's silence. She'd never be that girl again. The client Delphina mentioned turned out to be someone Wyatt already knew, at least, in the abstract sense. Malcolm Morton, tech tycoon, widower, face like granite, wallet like Fort Knox, and reportedly hadn't smiled since his wife died 2 years ago in a helicopter crash that made headlines for weeks. He didn't do interviews, didn't do appearances, but somehow he wanted this her. Why me? Wyatt asked Delphina as they sipped coffee on her rooftop, the morning after the gala. Delphina didn't look up from her phone. Because you look like someone who wouldn't ask that question. Wyatt raised a brow. And yet, I did. Delphina smiled now. Because men like Malcolm don't want lovers. They want witnesses. They want someone who can sit with their ghosts without flinching. 3 days later, she met him at a private lounge in the back of an art gallery. No security detail. Just him, already seated, staring at a sculpture that looked like pain frozen in marble. Malcolm was older than Caesar by at least 15 years, but he carried himself with a kind of quiet gravity. He didn't try to charm her, didn't bother with small talk. He looked up at her, gestured to the seat across from him, and said, "Tell me the worst thing you've ever done for money." Wyatt didn't blink. Stayed too long with a man who thought I was useful, but not lovable. He nodded slowly, as if the answer pleased him not for its content, but for its honesty. They talked for 2 hours. About nothing. About everything. He didn't ask her to dress up. He didn't ask her to play a role. He just wanted her presence, someone who could listen and hold eye contact without fear or flattery. By the end of the meeting, he reached into his coat and handed her an envelope. "Read it later," he said. Back in her apartment, she opened it. Inside was a check with too many zeros and a note in precise handwriting. "This isn't for company. It's for silence. I need to say things and never hear them again." Wyatt sat there for a long time, staring at the note, then at the city below. She knew now this was the kind of work that couldn't be taught. It wasn't about sex, or looks, or manipulation. It was about becoming something men couldn't name, but instinctively needed. She cashed the check the next day, and in the weeks that followed, Malcolm became something she hadn't expected. Constant. He called, but never late, invited her to his home, but never touched her. Sometimes they sat in silence for hours, the space between them thick with things unsaid. And yet, he never once made her feel lesser. Then came the night she told him about Caesar, not in detail, just enough to sketch the outline. Malcolm listened, leaning back in a leather chair with a drink he hadn't touched. "He told you what you weren't," he murmured. "But not once did he ask what you wanted to be." Wyatt looked at him, startled. "Exactly. Typical of men who build cardboard lives," he added. "They don't make room for complexity. It threatens the foundation." It wasn't love. She wasn't looking for that, but something passed between them that night. A recognition. Two people who had been loved incorrectly and chose not to crumble. Brannon noticed the shift first. He wasn't possessive, he had no claim, but he was observant. "You're distant," he said one evening after dinner, as she stared at her untouched dessert. "Even when you're right here." Wyatt hesitated, then set down her spoon. "Do you want me to lie?" Brannon sighed, already knowing. "No, I want you to tell me why a man like Malcolm, with all that darkness, feels safer to you than I do." She didn't have an easy answer. Maybe it was because Malcolm didn't ask her to shine. Maybe because he didn't try to fix her. He just let her be. Brannon didn't call after that. She didn't chase him. She was learning something about herself, something hard. That her value didn't lie in being adored or needed or kept. It lay in the simple, unshakable fact that she chose who got to know her, and what they had to pay for it. It was a Thursday when Caesar called. Wyatt saw the name flash across her screen while she was curled up on Malcolm's velvet sofa, barefoot, sipping jasmine tea. She hadn't spoken to Caesar in nearly 8 months. She didn't hesitate to answer, not because she wanted to, but because she wasn't afraid anymore. "Wyatt," he said, like he was testing the shape of her name again. She let the silence stretch before responding. "Caesar." There was a breath on the other end, shaky, unfamiliar. "I saw the piece in Modern Influence. You and Delphina. The luxury companion article." Of course he had. The photo of her had been tastefully done, nothing revealing. Just her seated on a white chaise, head tilted slightly, eyes soft but unreadable. It wasn't her body that spoke in that image. It was her detachment, her power. "You read it?" she asked, calm. "I didn't know that's what you were doing," he said quickly. "I thought you thought I was playing dress up," she interrupted, voice level. "Thought I'd fall apart without you." He didn't deny it. Then, quieter. "You're really living off men?" That did it. Wyatt felt the heat rise, not shame, just rage at how easily he reduced her life to a stereotype. "I'm not living off anyone," she said. "I'm charging for something. You never valued my time, my empathy, my silence. You think because there's no stethoscope involved, it's not real work?" "I didn't mean it like that." "You meant exactly that," she cut in. "You wanted me exhausted but humble. You wanted me helpful but quiet. Now I wear silk. And you don't know what to do with me." Another pause. "I miss you," he said finally, voice almost cracking. "I was wrong about what I said about you." She let the words sink in. They didn't hit the way he probably hoped. They didn't mend anything. They just sounded late. "You were wrong," she agreed. "But not just about me. About yourself." He didn't reply. She imagined him standing there in that sterile apartment, the same one they once shared, now colder without her breath in the rooms. "I wanted a life with you, Caesar," she said softly. "But you wanted someone who'd never remind you of your own smallness." That time, he didn't argue. "Goodbye, Caesar." She hung up. Malcolm had watched the entire thing without asking, without intruding. When she turned back to him, his expression was unreadable but not judgmental. "I like that," he said after a moment. "What? You didn't explain yourself. You just ended it." Wyatt smiled faintly. Explaining is something women do when they want to be forgiven. I don't. That night, Malcolm didn't speak much. He just moved to the piano in the corner of the room and played something low and haunting, his fingers gliding over the keys like they'd done it 1,000 times. Wyatt watched him, something unspoken simmering beneath the surface. She thought of the check, the envelope, the words he wrote. This time she spoke. Do you ever want more than this? He didn't look up. Sometimes. But wanting more doesn't mean I know what to do with it when it arrives. She leaned back into the cushions, letting that settle. For the first time, Wyatt didn't feel like she was performing. Not here. Not with him. She wasn't selling a fantasy. She was existing in a space where her complexity was not only tolerated but welcomed, and it made her wonder, could she ever really fall in love again after learning to price her affection? Could she even recognize love anymore, or had she turned it into a transaction like everything else? Her phone buzzed again. A message from Delphina. New offer. Dubai. 3 days. $500,000. Wyatt stared at it for a long moment. Then she looked at Malcolm. I'm not going, she said. His fingers paused on the piano. Why not? I think I want to find out, she said softly, what I'd do with more. If it showed up. He didn't smile, but the music changed, just slightly, like a conversation without words. The next morning was quiet, the kind of quiet that held meaning instead of emptiness. Malcolm was already up, reading on the balcony, with his glasses perched low on his nose and steam rising from a mug beside him. He didn't greet her with words, just lifted his eyes, nodded once, and returned to his page. That was his language. Presence, stillness, safety. Wyatt stood there for a moment, watching him. The sun lit the edge of his jaw, catching the silver streaks in his beard. He looked like a man who had lived through a war and built a mansion out of the rubble. Not perfect, but solid, real. Her phone was on silent. She didn't check it. Instead, she stepped outside barefoot, wrapping his spare sweater around her shoulders. He didn't move, just turned a page and waited. Tell me something ugly, she said as she sat down next to him. Malcolm gave her a side glance. Ugly? Yes, something no one would forgive you for, something that cost you. He leaned back, thought. Then, I married my wife because my board needed stability, not because I loved her. She knew it, but she married me anyway. Wyatt inhaled sharply. Did you learn to love her? I learned to need her, he replied. Not the same thing, but I tried to convince myself it was. She nodded slowly. You ever tell her that? I was going to, he said, but she died first. That's the part that cost me. They sat there in the soft breeze, nothing but traffic below and the sound of leaves brushing against the glass. You still talk to her? Wyatt asked. Malcolm didn't answer right away. Then he turned his head. You do? She blinked. What? You still talk to the man who broke you? Wyatt looked away, her lips pressing into a thin line. He wasn't wrong. Caesar lived in the background of her mind like static on a radio, faint, annoying, familiar. Not because she wanted him back, but because part of her still needed to prove he'd been wrong. I don't want to, she said. That's not the same thing. They sat in silence again, the hard kind, the kind that makes you feel every choice you've ever made. Finally, she stood. I need to go, she said. Malcolm didn't move. You'll be back. How do you know? Because you asked for something ugly, he said. People only do that when they're ready to stop pretending they're clean. Wyatt left without another word. But she didn't go to Dubai. She didn't go anywhere. She went home to her own place. The silence there wasn't heavy like Caesar's silence used to be. It was earned. It was hers. She cooked for herself, walked barefoot across cold tiles. She lit a candle not because anyone was watching, but because it smelled like orange blossoms and made her feel calm. That night, she opened a journal she hadn't touched in years and wrote one sentence. I became expensive because no one ever taught me I was priceless. She closed the book and turned off her phone. Let it all fade. 2 days passed. Then 3. No Malcolm. No Delphina. No Caesar. Just her. And then, on the 4th day, she heard a knock on her door. Not the concierge. Not a delivery. She opened it and there he was, Brannon Johns, hair tousled, tie loosened, a look on his face she hadn't seen before. Not arrogance, not amusement, something heavier. I need 5 minutes, he said. She opened the door wider without speaking. He walked in like a man unsure of his steps for the first time in his life. I've been thinking, he said, turning to face her. About why I felt so replaced. And it wasn't because you chose Malcolm, or the work, or the money. Wyatt crossed her arms. Then what? It was because you stopped needing me, he said. And I realized I never saw you as someone whole. I saw you as someone I could make complete. She didn't flinch. You wanted to be the hero. Yeah, he admitted, breath catching. But you didn't need saving. You just needed someone who wouldn't ask you to shrink. Wyatt tilted her head, thoughtful. And now, Brannon gave a small, sad smile. Now I'm just hoping for a chance to be someone you choose, not someone you fall into. She stepped closer slowly, looked up at him. Then don't bring flowers, she said. Bring honesty. And don't stay if you want the version of me who needed permission to matter. His eyes locked on hers. I'm not here for a version. I'm here for the whole thing. Wyatt didn't say yes, but she didn't ask him to leave. Brannon stayed, not overnight, not in her bed, not in any way that suggested possession or victory. He sat on her couch, shoes off, jacket folded beside him, and they talked about everything and nothing, about who they had been and who they had pretended to be. Wyatt told him things she hadn't told Malcolm because Malcolm didn't ask, not out of cruelty, but because he existed in a different kind of silence. Malcolm honored wounds by not touching them. Brannon, though, leaned in like a man unafraid to bleed. I used to lie to myself, she said, curled into one corner of the couch, knees pulled close. Back when I was with Caesar, I told myself I was happy just because I was needed. Brannon nodded. There's a kind of comfort in being needed. But it's a trap, isn't it? The worst kind, she said, because it looks like love, until it doesn't. He didn't speak right away. Then he asked, do you still talk to him? Wyatt hesitated. Not out loud, but yeah, sometimes, in my head, when I wonder what he'd say about the life I have now, when I hear his voice questioning it, still looking for his approval? No, she said, firmer this time. I'm making sure I never want it again. Brannon leaned forward, elbows on his knees, studying her like something valuable he didn't want to mishandle. I don't want to be another voice you carry around in your head, Wyatt. I just want to be someone who leaves space. Space for what? For whatever you become next. Those words stayed with her after he left, after the door clicked shut and silence crept back in. She didn't feel abandoned this time, just still, like she was exactly where she needed to be, even without knowing where that was. The next morning, Malcolm called. Dubai client passed, he said. Too young, too impatient. Delphina said you might be taking a break. I am, she said. Because of me? She paused. Partly. He didn't seem surprised. I'm not a man who asks twice, Wyatt. You know that. I'm not a woman who belongs to anyone, she replied. You knew that. He was quiet. Then gently, I liked you better when you were dangerous. She smiled faintly. I still am, just not in a way that serves you. They didn't say goodbye. The call simply ended. And that was that. Over the next few weeks, Wyatt Ray learned herself. She went back to nursing twice a week, just enough to remind herself she still had the hands of someone who healed. She read more, slept in when she wanted, took up pottery, of all things, and didn't care that she sucked at it. Brannon came around sometimes, never too much, always with a softness that surprised her. He brought her books, shared stories. They laughed like people who weren't trying to impress each other. He never tried to move in. He never called her babe or darling or mine. He called her Wyatt. And every time he said it, she felt more like herself. Then one night, after dinner, on her rooftop, he asked, do you think we're something? She looked up at him, a strand of hair caught in the wind, wine glass resting against her chest. We're not nothing, she said, but I don't want to put a name on it. Yet, I've done that before. It always made the thing smaller. He nodded. Okay. Just like that. No protest. No performance. And that's when she knew he might last. Not because he filled a hole, but because he didn't ask her to hollow herself out first. She leaned in and kissed him. Slow, steady, no fireworks, no breathlessness. Just real, grounding, warmth. Not the beginning of a fairy tale, but maybe the continuation of a life finally lived on her terms. It wasn't a love story, not in the usual sense. No epic confessions, no grand gestures, just small, deliberate acts of presence. Brannon never moved in, but his toothbrush appeared in her bathroom one day, tucked beside hers like it had been there all along. He didn't make a comment, and neither did she. That was how they existed now, without declarations, without pressure, only intention. Wyatt still had clients, fewer now, and only the ones she chose carefully. The ones who came not for fantasy, but for stillness, truth, insight. Her rate doubled, then tripled, not because she needed the money, but because scarcity had become her currency. People value what they have to earn, Delphina called one afternoon while Wyatt was on her balcony trimming dead leaves from a row of lavender pots she'd planted. I've got a new girl, Delphina said. She wants to be you. Wyatt smirked. Tell her to get a backbone and a heartbreak. That's how it starts. She's got both, Delphina said, but no edge. She thinks expensive just means red bottoms and silence. It doesn't, Wyatt said, snipping a dry stem. It means knowing you're not for sale, even when you set a price. There was a pause. Did I ever tell you, Delphina said slowly, that when I met you, I thought you were going to break? Wyatt laughed softly. I did. You just didn't notice it because I broke up, not down. Delphina exhaled. You're not going to be doing this forever, you know. I know, Wyatt said. That's the point. They ended the call without goodbyes, just the understanding of women who had both sharpened themselves against the rough edges of men, of money, of reputation. Later that week, Caesar emailed her, just a single line. I saw the news. Congratulations. It took her a full minute to realize what he meant. An article in the journal had listed her among the top 5 most influential private consultants of the year. They'd called her an architect of emotional luxury. It sounded absurd. It also wasn't wrong. She didn't reply. She didn't need to. A few days later, she stood at the mirror before dinner with Brannon, her hand hovering over a pair of earrings, small pearls or dramatic gold hoops. She went with neither. She looked at herself, no makeup, hair pulled back, clean skin and clear eyes, and realized she didn't need adornment. Brannon picked her up and they went to a small restaurant with no white tablecloths and no famous chefs. Just food that felt like care and conversation that didn't strain. Halfway through the meal, he asked, do you think you'll ever get married? Wyatt didn't answer right away. She sliced into her roasted vegetables slowly, then set the knife down. I don't know, she said. I used to think marriage was the prize. Now I think peace is. Brannon nodded like he understood, because he did. You'd be a terrifying wife, he said lightly. She raised an eyebrow. Why? Because you wouldn't need anything but love. And most men aren't built for that kind of pressure. She smiled. And you? He leaned back, hands laced over his stomach. I'm working on it. Later that night, after they'd come back to her place and undressed with the kind of comfort that comes from being seen every day and still chosen, Wyatt stood at the window while Brannon slept. The city blinked below. She wasn't waiting for a ring or a promise. She was finally free from the loop of proving, of pleasing, of asking to be picked. She had picked herself, and that, she realized, was the most expensive thing of all. The invitation came in a black envelope with her name embossed in gold. A T first. Wyatt didn't recognize the sender. The script was delicate, unfamiliar. Inside, the card was thick, heavy with weight and meaning. It was Caesar's wedding. He was marrying a woman named Adrienne Talsworth, classic last name, old money. The date was 2 months away. An estate upstate, formal, quietly extravagant. Just like him, she sat with it for a long time, the card resting in her lap like a dare. Brannon found her that evening in the same spot, eyes on the envelope, like it had spoken something cruel. You going? He asked. I don't know. He didn't push. Do you want to? Wyatt turned the envelope over in her hand. A part of me does. Not to crash it, not to make a statement, just to see. I don't know. Make it real. Brannon nodded slowly. You know you don't have to prove anything. I know, she said. That's why I might be able to go. When the day came, she wore black. Not out of pettiness, but because it was clean, simple, unreadable. The kind of dress that said, I am not here for anyone's gaze. The estate was breathtaking: old stone, white roses, a string quartet playing under a tree that probably had a name older than her grandmother. She walked in alone. Brannon had offered to come, but she told him this wasn't about support. It was about closure. Caesar saw her before the vows, across the courtyard, holding a glass of champagne she hadn't touched. His eyes flicked once, then again, like he didn't believe she was real. For a moment, he looked like he might walk over. He didn't. and that was growth for both of them. The ceremony was brief, tasteful, emotionless. Adrienne was beautiful, poised, a woman who likely had a degree in something decorative and a mother who never raised her voice. Caesar looked at her with soft eyes. Not the kind of love that scorched, the kind that didn't question. Wyatt watched them exchange rings with a stillness in her chest she hadn't known she was capable of. She didn't feel rage. She didn't feel grief. She just felt distance. During the mingling, he approached her. I wasn't sure you'd come, he said. She tilted her head slightly. I did. You look. He trailed off then. Tried again. Different. No, she replied gently. You just never saw me fully. He looked down, then up. I'm happy now. She smiled. I hope you are. He paused. Are you? I'm peaceful, she said. That's more honest. He looked like he wanted to say something else. Maybe apologize again. Maybe rewrite history. But Wyatt didn't wait for it. She stepped forward, kissed his cheek lightly out of kindness, not affection, and whispered, You were part of my making, not my breaking. Then she walked away, not dramatically, not tearfully, just away. She returned home that night and found Brannon in the kitchen, barefoot, slicing mangoes with his sleeves rolled up. He didn't ask how it went. He just poured her a glass of cold water and kissed her shoulder. They sat on the couch, eating fruit with their fingers, not saying much. And then he asked, very softly, Do you love me? Wyatt didn't answer right away. She looked at him, at the man who never once asked her to shrink, who met her edges with curiosity instead of fear. I do, she said. But not like a fire, more like a mountain. He looked confused for half a second, then smiled. Unshakable? No, she said. Solid and real, and something I can come back to without needing to burn first. He kissed her, not hungrily, not possessively, just enough to say, I hear you. And in that moment, Wyatt knew this wasn't the ending. This was the life she built from the ashes of what she'd been told she could never be. Not a wife, not enough. But now she was a woman who cost everything to lose, and no one would ever afford to lose her again. The end.